So let's move into the state section of this. We've kind of set the groundwork. It's all the federal stuff. And a lot of that, with the exception of ELDT, is stuff that you may not see on a regular basis. And, you know, maybe fortunately you never need to see it on a regular basis. ELDT is coming, so we have to be ready for that and we have to think about it. But let's now focus at the state level. So at a state level, we have two bodies of law. One is Ohio Revised Code, and the other is Ohio Administrative Code. And it's very important to understand that both of these are law. They're promulgated differently. They come into being differently, but they're both law. So, you know, none of these are the stop sign with the white ring around it that's optional. You have to comply with all of it. And so here's my goal in the next section. And I'm just going to tell you up front, we are not going to go through every individual piece of law. I'm going to hit the high points here. I'm going to throw a bunch of titles and codes and general concepts at you. If you have more interest in any of these, a lot of them I've included in the handouts, so you can read the exact, you know, all the here's, where's, therefores, and thou shouts. It's all in there. But what I want to do is try and build this framework so you have an understanding of how it all fits together. So first, let's talk about Ohio Revised Code, because this is really, there's three sections in 4511.76 that impact every school bus operation in the state of Ohio. This is unique in the country. In a lot of states, there's a section of codes that deal with public school operated school buses, and then a separate section of codes that deals with contract operated buses. In Ohio, we don't make that distinction. And I think that's a good thing. The bottom line is that if a child rides a school bus in Ohio, they all operate under the same rules. And so that makes things simpler. But it also means it's very important that we all have the same understanding. So regardless of who signs your paycheck, whether it's a treasurer for a public school district or a CFO for a private contractor, we're all compelled to follow the same standards. And so let me walk you through the three parts of 4511.76. And here's a case where the language in this code is very important. And so paragraph A says that the Department of Public Safety, and so for us, that's the State Patrol, by and with the advice of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, i.e. ODE, shall adopt and enforce rules relating to construction, design, and equipment, including the lighting equipment of all the school buses that are operated here in the state. Please note, publicly and privately owned. Again, this is all encompassing. So one sentence that summarizes this paragraph: State Patrol has the authority over construction, design, and equipment of our school buses. It wasn't always this way. Up until 99, ODE managed the school buses. And in 99, there was an agreement made here in Ohio, legislative action taken, and they moved school bus construction over to public safety. That's not a bad thing, because the State Patrol is already involved in the inspection of the vehicles, and it kind of made sense that the folks that are inspecting it also should be the folks that are responsible for the equipment and the design. Admittedly, some years that works better than others. It is important to note here that they are required to work with ODE. There is a construction standards group that, excuse me, has been in place since the 80s. Sometimes the patrol relies very heavily on it. Sometimes the patrol makes decisions on their own without using that group. But the bottom line is you need to know that construction of the buses is managed over at the patrol. Operations is under the authority of ODE. And so here's the language that sets that out. Department of Education, by and with the advice of Director of Public Safety, again, he delegates that to the State Patrol, shall adopt and enforce rules relating to the operation of all school buses, both publicly and privately owned in the state. So there's three things in here that I want to put on a table. One is Operations of school buses belongs to ODE. So that then translates into a body of law that we call the Pupil Transportation Operation and Safety Rules, which actually exists in an administrative code. Second thing, publicly and privately owned and operated. So again, no matter who signs the paycheck, who you work for, same rules for everybody. Here is the third point that I want to put on the table, and I put it out there because it's a challenging point. What this says is ODE shall adopt the rules, but it also says ODE will enforce the rules. Now, and I had to manage this a number of times during my tenure with the department over 12 years, is that ODE is not an enforcement agency. They're not structured as an enforcement agency. ODE can't go out and write a summons to court like a police officer can. And so we went over to public safety and say, okay, what's your role in this? And so I will tell you, even to this day, there's not a strong link between the adoption and the enforcement. There are some times where the state patrol will go out and get involved, but we have had public safety directors for the states take different positions on this. And the last one used to say, well, we don't promulgate the operating rules, so we're not going to enforce them. And that public safety director used to focus on saying, we're going to do enforcement on the construction standards, and ODE has to do enforcement on the operating standards. But for ODE to do enforcement, really the only tool they have is a very draconian tool, and that is to say, okay, we give you your funding, you don't comply, we're taking your funding away. And for ODE to have the authority to do that, first off, it has to be explicitly written into the funding codes. They have to have the authority to stop it. And you have to understand that taking funding away is a very delicate action that has political overtones, and it usually doesn't fix one problem. It usually causes a lot of problems. So I put that out there because it's a challenge. But really the takeaway from the slide is that, back up one here, public safety does design standards, ODE does operating standards, and then here's the next part to this. Who's subject to the regulations? So paragraph C in 451176 says, no person shall operate a vehicle used for pupil transportation in the state in violation of the rules of the Department of Education or Department of Public Safety. No person shall operate. So that's all of our drivers. Now, I'm going to back you up one slide here because I want to make one more point. We'll go 2 slides. Construction standards is school buses, right? Operating standards is school buses. Who's subject to the rules? It's no longer just school buses. It's any vehicle used for pupil transportation. So here is the piece of revised code that says ODE has authority over van operations. All right. So A and B talked about buses, but here we now talk about any vehicle used for pupil transportation. And so here, this originally at one point said buses, and then it got changed to vehicle. So here's where this gets expanded and includes vans. So the first person is all the drivers are impacted. The second person, the second part of this is if you're an owner of a vehicle and you have supervisory responsibility, guess what? That's us. That's you and me. So if you're a contractor, you own the bus, or if you're a supervisor for a school district, we can't allow the operation of the bus within the state in violation of the rules. So first part of the paragraph says all the drivers have to comply. Second part of the paragraph says you and I are just as responsible for making sure that the drivers comply. Right? So of all the sections of code that we're going to talk about today, 451176 is the one that I want you to remember. It's one to keep close to your desk because ultimately that's what says you and I have to follow everything in the administrative code. We don't have the option of picking and choosing. We might not agree with all the sections of code, but they're in there, and so we have to follow them. Okay? In your handouts, I've given you the complete text of a number of sections, other sections in the revised code. I just want to hit high points of them here. And really the goal here is to help you understand if a question comes up, here's where you go to look for it. By the way, in your handouts, there's a document that's entitled Ohio Laws and Rules Reference Chart. And so it's a two-sided document. Somebody pointed out to me yesterday I had a formatting error on it, so I fixed it. It will now print out on two sides of a page. I started, when I got into this business a lot of years ago, I just started a little cheat sheet that let me know where I needed to look if there was a subject that came up. And so what I've given you is actually that cheat sheet that I've maintained. And so it's grouped into topics. One is services, another is safety, another is vehicles. And I just added a couple more things to this last week that I became aware of. And so if you have a question in one of these areas, this will help you to figure out where to find either, excuse me, either the revised code or the administrative code that pertains to it. So some of these things you'll see on there, but I want to run through these very quickly. 4511.62, that's the section of revised code that says you're not allowed to operate a school bus without a valid sticker on the side. And so if one of your drivers were to take a bus out of the compound and pick up students without that sticker, that is a violation of the law and they can be cited for it. In that same paragraph, it talks about the requirement to have registration numbers on your bus. And so this is the 5-digit number you put on the front and the back. Those now have a Q in the front of them. You can operate a school bus temporarily for 30 days without those, but you do have to have a copy of the MVI team's inspection report on board. 4511.771 is the section of our code that mandates school buses have the 8-way light system. So that's the yellow and the red lights. A lot of folks think that's a federal standard. It's not. We still have some states in the country that are using the old 4-way system where all they have is the red lights. When I got into the business, that's all we had. And I remembered the conversion to adding the yellow lights to the buses. And I think that was a good thing. It helps, excuse me, to pre-warn traffic that the bus is getting ready to stop. 4511.79 has got some interesting language in it. It says driving a CMV with imperitability or alertness is prohibited. So if you go back to the drug and alcohol stuff that you'll hear in the clearinghouse or in the reasonable suspicion training, they talk about a 0.04 cutoff. What it says here is imperitability or alertness is prohibited. So that's not a 0.04 cutoff. That's if you have any alcohol in your system, you shouldn't be operating a school bus. And that's not a cutoff. That's a 0.00. 4511.75 is a requirement that traffic must stop for a stopped school bus. So there's two sides to this. One is, what do the motorists around the bus have to do? But this is also a very important section for you to provide your school bus drivers in an in-service, because there's 2 points in here that are critical for your drivers. If there are 4 or more lanes on the road the bus is stopped on, the school bus shall receive and discharge children on the resident side. Very clearly, children cannot be allowed to cross a 4-lane road. And so folks say to me, okay, is that cross streets? What's that pertain to? Think about this as the road the bus is stopped on. So if the road that bus is parked on has got 4 marked travel lanes, You cannot allow children to cross the street at the bus stop. At some point in your career, it wouldn't surprise me if you get a parent that writes a note to you, says, I don't care what your policy is, let my kid out here. I don't want them to ride another hour before the bus comes back. You don't have the latitude of saying, okay. And your response to that parent is, unfortunately, there's a law that prohibits us from doing this. And it's really safety based. I mean, you can explain all the safety reasons, but bottom line is school bus drivers can't allow children to cross 4 lanes of the road. We do get lawsuits on that. And we have a lawsuit pending right now in a school district in the state of Ohio where the driver allegedly allowed a child to cross 4 lanes of traffic, was struck by a car, and the motorist was not cited. And in fact, in the litigation, they're going after the bus driver for violating 4511.75. So make sure your drivers are aware of this code. And here's the second part of it. And there have been suits against districts in the state. The school bus driver may not start the bus until after a child has reached a place of safety on the child's residence side. So this is language I know your drivers have heard in the pre-service program. We also have in administrative code a requirement that drivers designate a place of safety for every child. So here it is in the revised code. Ultimately, that says, as a bus driver, you can't start your bus moving until that child has reached their place of safety, and it has to be on the child's residence side. So this is a tough one. This is easy for your bus drivers to teach the little people about, because the primary students and even the kindergartners are fairly receptive. Sometimes they react to their impulses and they take off running, but this is one where bus drivers find it easier to manage the kids. Bus drivers like to gloss over this point when they're talking about high school students, and they pretty much let the kids off the bus and the kids just start walking. If something happens to them and that bus driver didn't wait for them to get to their place of safety, guess who was wrong? Not the student, but the school bus driver. So put this in your next in-service with your folks. It's a good point for them to see firsthand. Here's the law. 451175 also goes on to say the school bus driver has to report violations. And there's a number of bills pending to help us with that. We have an incredible amount of drive-bys here in Ohio, as do all the states. And so there's some work being done legislatively to help give that a little bit stronger enforcement arm. A couple of other sections in code to be aware of. 451162 talks about railroad crossings. And if you read these two sections in concert with each other, the school bus has to stop. 63 allows designation of exempt crossings, and I think we're up to 40 or 50 of those in the state of Ohio. There's a list of them on our website. But going back to 62, it says that if there's a clear signal, there's a train coming, so it could be a flashing light, could be a gate, could be a flag person, or, and here's the ones that get us in trouble, if there's not enough room to cross the tracks, so the school bus driver has to look across the tracks, if there's an approaching train visible, or, and this is the one that, we laugh when we read it here, but it happens, if there's insufficient undercarriage clearance. I'm originally from Cincinnati, and we had a couple of tracks down there that school buses couldn't cross because the hump was too high, and front wheels would go across the track, and all of a sudden they'd leave the ground, the back wheels would leave the ground, and you got a train balancing on the tracks. So all these things are in place saying to our bus drivers, you have to be aware of this stuff. And then the second part of that, and here's the one where we get in trouble, because railroad crossings do malfunction. A sidebar here. The railroad will tell you that if the gate's down and there's no train coming, it hasn't malfunctioned. It's gone into its default safety mode and it's doing exactly what it's supposed to. But the bottom line, if there's a gate down or a red light crossing and there's no train approaching or moving, the bus driver cannot, of their own volition, decide to go across the tracks. And likewise, they can't call you and by radio and say, what do I do? Motorola is not authorized to tell them to cross the tracks. The only way a bus can go across when there's one of the conditions in the above paragraph is if they're signaled across by either a railroad flag person or law enforcement. So quite frankly, usually the easiest thing to do is to have them turn around and go a different route. 4511.78 is a section of code that says children are allowed to use mass transit. So those are the public transit buses in most of the 8 urban centers. Kids are allowed to ride those. There are some conditions for them. And then I want to talk very briefly about child restraint systems. So that there's administrative code on this. There's also a revised code. The revised code is in 451181. Here's the most important sentence. It's the first one. It says, child restraint systems are required in any vehicle required by US DOT to have passenger restraints. So think about school buses. The vast majority of the buses in the state of Ohio weigh more than 10,000 pounds. Right? So the only buses that are going to be subject to this are going to be the minibuses. And those already come from the manufacturer with passenger restraints in them. Please note, I'm not saying seatbelts. A seatbelt alone is no longer a qualified passenger restraint. They now have to be 3-point restraints. So if the vehicle is required to have passenger restraints, so under 10,000 pounds, then the following are true. A child that's less than 4 or less than 40 pounds has to be in a safety seat. A child that's less than 8 and less than 4'9", if they don't meet the less than 4, they have to be in a booster seat. And children between the ages of 8 to 15 years old have to wear a passenger restraint. So put these all in context. If you're driving a full-size school bus and it doesn't have belts in it, there's no requirement for you to put toddlers in safety seats. In fact, if you don't have FMVSS compliant passenger restraints in there, you can't put them in a safety seat, because if you look at the operating instructions on a child safety seat, it clearly says the seat must be attached to the vehicle with an FMVSS compliant passenger restraint system. So here's where we get into this difficult thing about how do we handle our preschoolers and the little ones in a full school bus. Don't read this as saying, I don't have to restrain little kids in a big bus. No, the law says you don't have to, but let's be very, very practical. If you don't find a way to glue those little tykes down in a school bus seat, they're not staying in the seat, right? So here's where we have to figure out how to get it done. So you have some options. You can purchase buses with federally compliant passenger restraint systems in them. And that would then allow you to put a child safety seat in there. You can also add aftermarket vest type systems where there's a belt that goes around the seat back to hold them in there. That will work. There are also specialty seats in the school bus market that are what they call convertible seats. And some of them have a panel that drop in. You can put a little tyke in there. So the reality of this is in a full-size school bus, the safety seat and the booster seat and the other law don't apply to us. However, from a practical standpoint for the little tykes, we do need to find a way to buckle them in, and we have to do that in a compliant manner, and there's administrative code that deals with that. You can't simply put Velcro on the seat or duct tape around the kid, or, in the old days, we used to take a really, really long safety belt and just wrap around the seat and the kid. You can't do that anymore. So if you use a safety seat, you need to have a federally compliant passenger restraint belt in there to hold it down. Or you can use one of those convertible seats that are sold by the companies. Or you can use the vest system. And yes, new buses, many of them you can order, and this is what we recommend, order your new buses with the first 3-4 rows of seats with federally compliant restraint systems on them. That kind of solves the problem for you. They don't come automatically that way. You need to spec them that way. So we can give you some help specing buses if that's what you need. All right, last section outside of 3327.1 that I want to put on the table for you. 45 is 6.161, and I hope you never need this section of code, but you need to know it's there. Limited driving privilege is not granted to a person under suspicion. So what happens in Ohio if somebody gets pulled over for DUI, OMVI, or something like that, usually their license is immediately forfeit. Those folks will get an attorney, they'll go to the court, and they'll ask for limited driving privileges that allows them to go back and forth to work. And so what happened was we realized this was happening to, unfortunately, it happened to a couple of school bus drivers. School bus drivers in their own personal vehicles were stopped and charged. Their license was taken away, and the court was giving them limited driving privileges. Well, it not only happened in the school bus industry, but also in the trucking industry. And pretty soon everybody came to realize that this really shouldn't be something the court has authority to. And so there was a section of revised code added that says the courts cannot issue limited driving privileges for someone to operate a CMV. So the only way that person can get a limited driving privilege, they would have to forfeit their CDL, downgrade that to a regular operator's permit, and then they could get limited driving privileges that allows them to go back and forth to work. However, since they forfeit their CDL, they can no longer drive a school bus in our case. And if their case is dismissed by the court and they walk away with it with nothing on their record, they still have already given up their CDL. So they would actually have to, in this case, go through ELDT, get their CDL back, and start all over again from ground one. It's not a reinstatement, it's a relicensing. So important section of code for you to know. Any questions here? Let's see. What's on the chat box? Are seatbelts an approved passenger restraint system in advance? So in your vans, because they're 9 passengers or less, 10 occupants or less, they're all under 10,000 pounds. So those vehicles come from the manufacturer with an approved FMVSS passenger restraint system. So they already come that way. So if you're putting your special ed kids, your preschool kids in vans, you are subject to the codes on passenger restraints. All right, we're going to spend the next chunk of time on revised code 3327. So what I have provided for you in your handouts is this entire chapter, and I put footnotes in it. So as you go through there, you're going to see footnoted messages. If you look up the law online or in an Anderson's Law book, you won't find those footnotes. Those came from me. And so we're going to talk about some of those footnotes today and some of the things that I want you to remember and take away from the law. I want to make an important point. We're not going to talk about 3327.10. We did that in depth last month. It is included in your handout today. If there's folks on today's conference that weren't in the personnel class, I encourage you to go back and look at the material from our last class, because we went into 3327.10 in depth in that class. So we're going to hit everything else today. All right, so let's run through this. So 3327.01, that is the code that tells us who we have to transport. And so included in these different types of students, we need to make some considerations. There are special education children, there are regular education children, there are children that attend non-chartered, unapproved schools, and there are children that are involved in open enrollment. So let's break these down by different pieces here, and I'll do this by jumping forward here. For special education, you need to remember a very important point. Transportation service is actually based more on federal law than it is on the state law. Every one of these little kiddos should have an individual education program, which we call an IEP. And in those IEPs, the team will address accommodations that must be made for that child to access appropriate public education. So lots of times that'll involve transportation. And so if in the IEP it says this child needs door-to-door service or needs to be restrained, those are accommodations. And as a service provider, we are compelled to provide those. We are also, in most cases, compelled to provide transportation for these students. That's usually a basic accommodation, because a lot of these special ed kids, if they walked out the front door of their house and you hope for them to be able to get to school because it's less than 2 miles, some of them just won't make it. So it's not uncommon to see an accommodation listing on an IEP that says transportation must be provided from door to school. And that's an appropriate way to safeguard them. For regular education students, so this includes not only the public school students, but the non-publics and the community school students. You need to think of all these as eligible children inside your district. As a school district, we are required to offer service for students in grades K through 8 that live 2 miles or more away from schools. And so again, the point is these are all residents of your district. They're students attending eligible schools. Now, what's included when we talk about eligible schools? Eligible schools means your own public schools. It means non-public schools that have been chartered or approved by the Department of Education, and community schools, or we also call them charter schools, that have been approved by the Ohio Department of Education. We have in Ohio some independent schools that don't go through that process, and they're called non-chartered or non-approved schools. You have no obligation to serve them. So our obligation is to transport any students that reside in our district attending an eligible school. At the end of the day, if you want to know if a school is eligible or not, that information comes through ODE. So the minimum, and here's where things are unique in Ohio, the minimum is K through 8 2 mile. You as a school district are allowed to provide more service than that. So we don't require transportation for high school students, but we allow it. We don't require transportation for students that live a mile from school, but we allow it. So here's the caveat. If you do that, you have to do it for everybody in the same category. Let me look over here in the questions for just a second. Question about railroad track exemptions. How do you inquire while a railroad that is not being used, grass growing up in the tracks, is not exempt? So for any questions on railroads, if your questions are about exempt tracks, you want to contact the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. They are the overseeing authority on railroads. If you believe there's, in what's being described in the question, sounds like a spur track. And so the very first thing you do is you contact PUCO and have a conversation with them, and they'll explain to you whether it's eligible, whether they can consider it or not. All right, so back to 332701. Here's some things we need to clarify. When we talk about this notion of 1 mile from school, 2 mile from school, how do we define that? So in just a moment, I'm going to define that for you so that we use the same standard. Same basis is a very important notion. Remember when I said if you offer high school for one group of students, you have to do it for all. So here's the thing. Treat all these children as the same. They are resident students within your district. So you can't transport just the non-public high school or just the public high school. You have to do it for all high school students. Now, for non-publics and community school, I need to amend the slide, sorry about that. We have what we call a 30-minute rule. And in the 30-minute rule, it says that if a child elects to attend a school that's more than 30 minutes away from their district school of attendance, you don't have to bus them. And I will share with you the exact language on that when we get into the administrative code. So there are some carve-outs. 332701 also requires you to have a time schedule adopted and in place within 10 days. So read that as you have to have a routing schedule. And that routing schedule has to include the stops, the time at the stop. It's not acceptable in the eyes of either the revised code or the administrative code to simply send a letter out to the parent saying, well, the bus leaves the barn at 7 o'clock and it goes down Main Street, turns left on this, turns right on that, and gets back to school. So just watch for it. That's not considered an acceptable time schedule or is an accepted bus route. And now we're going to talk just a little bit about impractical and payment in lieu of. This is a whole class in itself, and that comes up in the MTA cycle, not this year. But I'll talk just very little bit about it. If you have more questions about that, I want you to reach out to me. All right, let's talk about distance measurement. How do you figure out if a kid lives far enough away from school to be eligible? This actually comes out of Administrative Code 3301-8301, but it's important enough that I wanted to put the words up here on the screen for you. You can read it in the code. It's in the handouts also. Measurement, there's a question in there about open enrollment. We'll get back to that in just a second. Measurement of distance originates at a point on the traveled portion of the roadway nearest the primary entrance to the place of residence. So what's that mean? Well, it's where the driveway hits the public roadway. And then along the most direct route traversable, excluding interstate routes. So when you're measuring distance, I want you to think about this as theoretically the child could be asked to walk this distance. So we don't use the interstate route. We never do anyway, but traversable by direct distance by motor vehicle to the school bus loading area nearest and opposite the entrance door. So you go up the driveway to the school and you stop measuring where the buses unload next to the entrance door. All right, so you start at home at the driveway, shortest driving distance, go to school, go up the driveway, you stop measuring when you get to the front door. All right, so that's the measuring distance. In the code, this is specific for measuring whether students are eligible for payment or not. I will say to you, if you measure distance in your district, if your district adopts a 1 mile eligibility zone or a half-mile eligibility zone, I would encourage you to follow the standard for all measurement. I have worked with districts that have used a compass to draw a circle around the school. That'll get you in trouble every time because it may take you less distance to get to one house than it does to another within the circle because you got to go outside of the circle to come back in. You always want to measure distance as the shortest driving distance. So how do you do that? If you have a routing system that is based on DOT routing maps, not estimated, but real routing maps, I know that Transfinder does this. You can actually use the computer software to measure that distance. You can't get this off of Google or other things like that. Usually the only way you can get this precisely is you could do it in a vehicle, but the vehicle has to have a certified odometer. And I've worked in cases where we actually had to get out and walk it with a surveyor's wheel to measure it. As a rule of thumb, and this was part of our routing class, which was our very first class, I would say to you, when you do routing eligibility, I would make it neighborhood based. That way you don't end up with lines between neighbors, which is always a tough thing. But this is the code that you should lean on if you need to measure distance for eligibility. Okay, so here's the carve-outs. And somebody asked me a question about open enrollment. Here's where we get into open enrollment. For JVS students, which probably I should probably retitle this as career tech students. As a district, you're required to provide a shuttle service between your high school and the building where they get their educational service. So you are not required to provide service from home to the JVS program. At the very least, you're required to run a shuttle from your high school building to their building where they get educated. We have a thing in Ohio called STEM schools. Students attending STEM schools, in many cases, there's a contract in place between the feeder districts, and usually that contract will address transportation. If it doesn't, you treat them like any other resident student in the district. Preschool transportation is optional for the regular ed students. It is required for preschool students that have an IEP that include some kind of an accommodation for transportation. Open enrollment, now we got to talk about two different kinds of open enrollment here. There is intra-district and there's inter-district. If it's intra-district, which means between another district and yours, I'm sorry, intra-district is just within your district. Your district can adopt its policy. So if you have kids that normally attend elementary A, but they want to go to elementary B instead, as a district, you have to have a policy, but the policy does not require you to transport. So you could say to them, well, you can go to any school in the district you want to, but mom's got to get you there. Or you could say, well, we'll transport from pickup points and do transfers. So you can do whatever policy you want. It's up to your district. Now, open enrollment between districts is a little bit different. Let me look here. I think I have a slide on it. Maybe not. So let's talk about it very quickly. There is a section of code that deals with this. Here's the essence of it. You are not required to go into another district to pick up kids that your district has accepted as open enrollment. You're allowed to if you want to, but you're not required to. What the law says, and there are some different interpretations of this, but what the law says is inside your district, you're required to have a policy that includes transporting these students from a available bus stop to their school. So if you have seats available on the bus and your district's policy says we will transport these children, then you as the transportation director need to find the bus stop that's closest to where they live. So it's going to be in your district, but closest from where they come, and say, okay, here's the corner where your child needs to get on the bus, and here's the corner where your child will be brought home at the end of the day. Now, I'm going to digress here for just a moment because I want you to think about the practical application here. In the morning, if you pick up that student at the stop, mom or dad drove them there and put them on the bus, it's all good, right? But in the afternoon, if your bus driver gets to the corner and you drop off a child who lives outside the district and you know they live another 2 miles outside the district and there's no parent there to receive them, now we have a problem, right? Because if something happens to that child, we have another section of code that says if it happens to that child at a bus stop they were designated at, and it's more than a half a mile away from their home, there's a notion that we have some liability for what happens to the child. And more practically speaking, if you drop off a first or second or third grader at a stop that's in the district and you know they live out of the district, there's no one there to receive them, the bus driver is not going to want to do that, right? So that's the danger in designating out-of-district students to a stop that's inside your district. There are some practical ways to work around that. One of the things I did in the 20 years that I was in school districts is I said to open enrollment students, if you want a bus ride, you need to find a sponsor family. And you can ride to and from the same stop where that sponsor family is. And we did that so that if a child got off the bus, they would have a home to go to. Sometimes it's a daycare center, sometimes it's a sponsor family. But just know that the law that requires transportation doesn't require you to go out and get them, but it does speak to what you can offer inside the district based on board policy. All right. So again, here's where you want to work carefully with the superintendent and the school board. Make sure you have a policy that supports how you do things. All right. So question about STEM schools. STEM school moved 40 minutes away from the high school. Are you still required to transport? And the answer to that is if there's a contract in place. So you need to take a look at the contract to figure out, is there a requirement? And if there's a requirement inside that contract, then you have to do it. If there's no contract, then they're outside that 30-minute rule. And no, you would no longer transport. Next question is, can open enrolled students that are from between districts be counted on T1 reports, or are they exempt riders? So we have a little issue here that we're actually in the process of resolving. There's a House bill moving through. I will tell you that if you read the open enrollment section in revised code, that it tells you if you transport those students that you are allowed to report them on the T1. However, ODE for the last couple of years has told districts they're not allowed to report them. We believe that's in direct conflict with the law and it's an inaccurate requirement. So there are some districts that have challenged ODE on that. We've actually got a bill moving through right now that changes some of the language in there that will actually solve that problem. And we're going to talk about that very briefly at the end of today's presentation. So the answer to the question is, if you asked me as a consultant whether you should count those open enrollment students, I would say to you, yes, you should, because the section of revised code that tells you you have a modified obligation to transport also says you're allowed to report for funding. So I would say yes to it. Alternative schools. I'm going to come back to that in another slide. And then the other question here, some of you may remember something that we called PSEO, which was post-secondary enrollment options. Those are high school students that attend college. We used to have to provide some transportation. That is now gone. Those students are no longer transported. The authority for that whole program has been moved away from the Department of Education and over to the Board of Regents. So you no longer have to transport high school students to colleges. So that's a yippee. All right, let's move on here. Just a sidebar. If you're reading the architecture of the revised code, it doesn't always look logical. 3327.013 is actually considered to be part of a 0.01 section. So you would think, okay, it'd be 1, 2, 3, just like we normally count, but when they put an O in front of it, it's actually a subsection of 01. So 013 specifically gives you the authority to transport preschool students, not just the atypicals, but also the typicals. 014 gives school boards the authority to suspend students from transportation. And what it says is it authorizes the superintendent or his or her designee to suspend students from transportation. And 015 is the one that we're tripping over a little bit. This was implemented in the last school year, where the legislature enacted a new rule saying the board may not reduce transportation service once started in a school year. So the essence of it is, and this all had to do with levy campaigns, is that if a levy fails, you run a November levy and it fails, you can't say to the community, okay, we're going back to state minimum service January 1st. We have some problems with this bill, and we've actually we lobbied against its enactment. We're still lobbying to see if we can't get it amended. It's actually a bigger problem right now under COVID-19 because there's districts that have said, okay, we're out of bus drivers, they're too sick, or they haven't come back, and we can't run buses. And on the face of it, the law says you can't cancel your bus service. However, This is one of those things that, and we've asked the legislature to introduce some exceptions to deal with COVID-19. So just know that's out there. But in a regular year, you can't start service on day one and then cancel it 30 days later. So let's talk a little bit about impractical. Andreas, you bring a good point. When district is going from face-to-face to remote, yes, we're canceling bus service and we're doing a lot of things under COVID that actually fly in the face of some of the laws out there. We're doing what we have to do right now. So I'm going through these rules, and for some of these, you need to think, okay, if we ever get back to normal, that's when they apply. Right now, there are some things that we don't have official dispensation to ignore them, but we're doing what we have to do. Let's talk very briefly about impractical. The other carve out in transportation is that as a school board, you have the option to say transportation for a particular child is impractical. So again, we have a whole class on this. I just want to hit the high points here. Know that a couple things. One is it's very tightly scripted. So you have to follow the language in the code very, very carefully. We can help you with this. If it goes to a contest and the parents push back, I'm going to say to you, well, I will help you, but I want you to get legal counsel involved. Whatever attorneys your district leans on, they need to be at the table too. All three of us can join in together with conversations, phone calls, and research. But at the end of the day, you are going to want to have legal counsel involved because it is a very technical and legally scripted process. You have to follow all the steps in order and on time. That said, it's very doable. And if it's appropriate for your district, I would tell you to pursue it. We'll help you, we'll coach you, we'll get you through it, but it's something you should go through. Now in O2, there are 6 specific reasons that talk about when you can declare transportation impractical. So these are hard coded. They're in the revised code. And I have summarized them here with just a few words, but this is something you want to look very carefully at the law, make sure you understand them. We talk about the time and distance to transport students to school. Talk about the number of pupils to be transported. This is usually what starts the conversation at a district level. We need to talk about the cost of providing transportation. We have to talk about whether similar or equivalent service is provided to other pupils. This is the one that says, okay, you can't declare all non-public transportation impractical, right? Because you are providing similar or equivalent service for many of your public school students. So this is the same basis sentence. You talk about whether and to what extent service is disruptive. In other words, if someone else picks the same bell time as yours and they're 20 minutes outside of the district, are you required to take all your buses off your elementary routes just to serve that building? That most certainly is disruptive, and so we would look at that. And then finally, whether there are other reimbursable types of transportation available. At the end of the day, all of these really boil down to cost. And so if we were to work with you to help you sort one of these out, what we're going to do is we're going to figure out, okay, what's the average cost of transporting a normal student going to a traditional public school? And then what's the cost of providing transportation for these students going to a non-public school? Very simply put, look at the number of students on the bus. You know what the cost of the bus is. And so the cost per child for someone going to your middle school, $50,000 bus, you have 50 kids on there, it's $1,000 per child. But if you only have 5 children riding a bus, and that's a $50,000 bus, now all of a sudden the cost is $10,000 per child, right? Very different scenario. So at the end of the day, this all boils down to cost. We do have to do, again, I want to say this one more time before I move on. You have to follow all the steps in order and on time, and you need to do your homework on these 6 reasons. There's help out there if you're going through that. I would encourage you to ask for help and get help. We can help you. Legal counsel can help you. You don't want to struggle through this on your own. It's easier to do it right and be successful than to have to do it again. All right, we need to talk. I'm going to talk about two sections together, and they are 332704 and 05. And what they say in concert is, as school districts, we're not supposed to transport students from another district that are also being served by that district unless you get permission. Here's the problem with that. I think that almost all the districts in the state are working together, and I think that's a great thing. I think when you work together and maybe you say to your neighbor district, you know, I'll haul these kids, you haul those kids, we're both going to the same place. It makes life easier for both of us. You do it. I think that's a great thing. That's cooperation and coordination. You want to have something in writing that memorializes that, so that if one of you moves on, works for another district, or retires, or God forbid gets COVID and can't work anymore, you want to have something in writing somewhere to document what you're doing, so that it shows up as a formal agreement between the districts. And that keeps you harmless in the eyes of this particular section of code. Here's the other part, and this is relatively new. This was adopted right around 2011, 2012. We've had cases where we've said to parents, no, we're not going to transport your child because it's more than 30 minutes away. Or no, we're not going to go there because it's disruptive to us and we can't afford to put a bus out there. So there's now a section in law that says if mom or dad still wants their child to go to that school, they can go to a neighboring district and ask that neighboring district to transport their child. And we used to say, and I used to say this all the time when I worked for the department, if a child's ineligible from one district, they're ineligible from all districts. Well, the legislature adopted an amendment to 332705 that threw that out of the window. And in essence, what it says is, even if they're ineligible from one district, if that district's not serving, mom or dad can go to another district that is running a bus and say, will you transport my child? And that other district is allowed to do that. All right. And so we need to talk about the process to do that. And that's in 332705. So the first thing, these first 2 points are, if you're transporting another district students, instead of doing releases, I would suggest you just have business agreements between the two districts saying, okay, I'll transport these kids for you, you transport these kids for me. When it comes to open enrollment, we have districts that do what I jokingly say is poach. They accept open enrollment students. They want them because it increases their ADM, which increases their base funding. So they now send school buses out into the neighboring district and pick kids up. Are they allowed to do this? Yes. There's nothing in law that says you can't pick up kids out of your district. And we've had some superintendents that said that should be the law, but it's not. But you're not required to do it. So if you are educating students and you've accepted them under open enrollment, you are allowed to transport. You don't need a release. This last one is the parental request thing. So I know these two slides are kind of jumbled with each other. I apologize for that. If a neighboring district has refused transportation and a parent comes to you and say, will you bus my kid? I know you're already sending a bus there. You have to take it to your board. All right. So the parent has the right under the law to request that transportation. You're not required to transport, but you are required to respond to the parental request. And I would advise you to take it to your board, work with the superintendent, go to the board. And a decision has to be made. Yes, we'll honor that transportation request. You'll need to meet us at such and such a stop. Here's the conditions. Or you can say, no, we're not going to do that. That's an acceptable response. Now, mom and dad won't like that, but you have now fulfilled your obligation under the law. So here's what's important is if somebody comes to you from out of the district and says, will you bus my kid? The answer is no, we're not allowed. The answer is give me the request in writing and we'll consider it and we'll get back to you. All right, so that's the process. Moving on through this chapter, 332707 says that, this is interesting because we're not allowed to, non-public schools can provide their own transportation service and charge for that. And we have some in the state that do that. That doesn't relieve you from offering service. And so let's say there's a non-public high school that runs a high school bus that charges the parents $1,000 a year to ride the bus. And the parent says, I don't have that kind of money. And they come to you and say, I want you to run the bus instead. The answer is not, well, we don't have to because they are. The answer is, well, we'll consider it. And so here's what you have to consider. If most of those kids are riding the non-public high school bus and you only have one or two requests, you might want to consider it as an impractical. All right, take a look at how many students. Is it disruptive? How far away is it? Are they within the 30-minute rule? All right, so you still have to consider all those things. You can't just blow it off because the non-public is doing it. 332708 sets the standards for bus purchase bidding. We were able to get an amendment passed, I think 2 years ago now, that says you no longer have to do a bid bond. So that was a cost-saving event for you. So that was an important improvement in that section. But that talks about what it does is it does require you to go through the competitive bidding process. Again, that's a service we can help you with, but you don't need a bid bond. 332709 sets the standard for the minimum insurance levels. Again, not just for the public schools, but for the private operators also. And 332712, I know I'm moving very fast through these sections. These are things that are not day-to-day that you just might run into. So I want to throw them out there at the wall just so the high level sticks. 332712 gives you the authority to maintain a turnaround. So this is the one that allows you to ask the maintenance team in your district to go out and throw a load of gravel down on a turnaround point. So if the superintendent says to you, that's private property or public property, we're not allowed to use this. If it's private property, get permission from the owner. And here's a section of code that says you are allowed to maintain that property. In 13 and 14, this kind of goes back to when we're talking the federal standards and we're talking commerce, what you can use buses for. Here's a section of code that says specifically you are allowed to have a lease agreement with a non-public school and you're allowed to have a lease agreement with a senior citizens group. Now I'm going to tell you up front, lease agreement is probably the wrong word. And we've actually been working with the legislature to try and get some of this language amended. You're not going to lease your bus to these groups. What you're going to do is say, we'll provide transportation for you. So it is perfectly acceptable for you to run a field trip for a non-public school or a community school. It's perfectly acceptable for you to run trips for senior citizens groups. Here's the law that says you're allowed to do this. We have a slide in here. One of the things that we're asking to get through in the bill is to expand this to allow you to use your buses for all purposes. I believe that's coming. So we'll get to that in a minute. But here's where this section of code talks about what you're allowed to do. 332715 is the one that says you can't go more than 1,000 miles out of state on a bus. So let's be real clear about the context here. It's a 1,000-mile travel limit outside of state. So if you're in Cleveland and you want to go to Lexington, the first 300 miles in Ohio doesn't count. You start counting the mileage when you cross the line, when you cross the river down in Cincinnati. So you can't travel more than 1,000 miles out of trips. That's total miles. So that's there, it's back, any side trips you make on the way. If you want to send a group down to the Florida Keys, they have to use a commercial carrier. 332716 is a section of code that gives you the authority to designate volunteer bus riders. So if you want to have parent volunteers riding on the buses, you can. And here's a section of code that allows you to do this. It also, inside that section, says that you as a district get to set the standards for what kind of qualifications they need to meet. All right. So with that, we are going to move out of the revised code and into the administrative code. Any questions on anything we've done in revised code? I know we have an attorney friend of mine attending with us today, and she's going to say, man, you hit the high level on that and probably didn't hit any of the detail. You're right. That was on purpose, Holly.
We understand everything now, Pete.
That was funny. Again, my goal is I want you to recognize where some of these things are and know that at the end of the day, look at the handouts, look online, call your attorneys, get interpretations. But I just want you to know these things are out there. So